Welcome to this first event in our series, Obedience and Disobedience, Taking Action on Climate Change. My name is Stephen Collis. I'm with the Department of English, along with Dr. Lynn Cornby. I'm convening this series. I do want to begin, though, first off, with acknowledging that we are gathered on unceded Coast Salish territory, and thank the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. That's sort of doing double duty right now, I think, for me. On the one hand, it's sort of the bare minimum protocol that I think we need to do on these unceded territories, bare minimum. But I also think it's very apropos of this course. When you're considering civil disobedience, you might think of a very traditional definition, which one definition might go something like breaking an unjust law in order to change that law in an otherwise just society. But I think when you have this awareness of unceded territory, when you're living in a time of renewed attention to things like land claims and Aboriginal title, the very foundation, the ground, literally, that we're on, the ground of the society, is a complicated issue to parse. And therefore, what is the nature of the society whose rules we may or may not be obeying is something that's a little more complicated, perhaps, than it might be in another context. When you add climate change to the mix, and I think, obviously, very often when issues around land claims and Aboriginal title are in the media right now, it's often in the context of resource extraction and the proposed or existing fossil fuel infrastructure. It's quite often where we're meeting these issues. So when you add that complexity, the complexity of climate change, once again, I think we find ourselves asking, are we, when we're considering acts of civil disobedience, are we trying to change one thing, say the National Energy Board of Canada, we could highlight, or is that may itself be unjust, or is it the entire basis of a society that seems either unwilling or unable to deal with a problem like climate change? Are we questioning the very validity and justifications for what that society is doing? So these are some of the issues we will be carefully tiptoeing into the minefield of in the coming weeks. I just want to tell really briefly an anecdote about how Dr. Cornby and I came to think of and propose this series. And we met at a poetry reading. So I was reading a poem here on campus in the library that happened to cite some climate science. And sometimes you can actually make poetry out of climate science, occasionally. And at the end of this reading, this woman approached me and said, "Hi, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Lynn Cornby, the chair of molecular biology and biochemistry." I always leave that part off. And biochemistry here at SFU. And I'd like to talk to you about civil disobedience. So it's a weird moment of poetry reading, poet, scientist, and the point we meet at is a conversation about civil disobedience. So that was quite interesting, and I could tell interesting things were going to come from this. So here we are. We proposed this series, and lo and behold, our president, Andrew Petter, said yes. So it's my pleasure now to introduce President Petter. And the main thing I want to say about him is that it's pretty incredible that such a thing as this dream colloquium exists, that there is this space for this and the resources provided to create truly interdisciplinary learning moments that don't fit in the boxes the university usually finds itself falling into. That you really can get outside and do something that's crossing the university's disciplinary boundaries, but also stepping very, very much into the public sphere. So thank him for that, and welcome President Petter.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. And first of all, let me start by joining with you in acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And I think it's an important acknowledgement for the university as a whole, and as Stephen said, particularly in the context of some of the issues raised in this colloquium series. I also, Stephen, you captured so well, much better than I ever could, what the colloquium, the idea of the Dream Colloquium, some people think the title is a little hokey, but what it was all about. It was, in fact, created in 2012 to provide an opportunity for people to dream, to create a interdisciplinary dialogue among students and faculty and staff on topics that wouldn't find their way into the classroom in quite the same way, to bring people together to have an engagement around those topics that was intellectually interesting, but also hopefully meaningful to you as citizens, as students, as people within not only the university, but the broader society. And I must say, we've had a number of Dream Colloquia now over a number of years since 2012, and I personally have not been disappointed, and I think those people who've participated have not been disappointed. This spring, we're fortunate to have 2 colloquia series, and they come with a wonderful lecture series, each of them. You can see the lecture series that's associated with this Dream Colloquium, and the focus, as you know, on this one is on obedience and disobedience, taking action on climate change. But there's also another one running in tandem, which is equally interesting, on protecting Indigenous cultural heritage, emergent policy and practice, which began last week. And if you weren't able to catch the first lecture last week, it's now being webcast through the Dream Colloquium webpage. So feel free to check out that, and by all means to join in future lectures. I understand some of them, in fact, I think one is already sold out, but some of them are filling up quickly. So if you're interested, I encourage you to put your name down and to participate. Some of you may not know, but the Colloquia series was designed to achieve really 3 benefits. One was to create an interdisciplinary opportunity for faculty and students and staff to come together and have discussions that would hopefully lead to a whole bunch of unexpected and wonderful things, and that certainly has happened. The other is just to provide a wonderful set of lectures from leading academics around the world on topics that matter to people across the university. And the third is the colloquium actually provides a teachable moment, very literally, because students can enroll in the colloquium for credit. And by doing so, not only reflect on the topics and get to meet some of these extraordinary speakers, but do research in areas related to the topics and gain credit for doing so. So in all those ways, I'm very excited about not only this colloquium, but about all the colloquia we've had. And I think they do very much reflect the vision that we came together around a few years ago of an engaged university, a university that's engaged within the campuses we have on topics of concern, and very much concerned about what goes on in the broader society. And the topics of most of the colloquium series that we've had reflect that, as well as this one certainly does. Now, this particular colloquium was proposed, as I think Stephen alluded, some time ago, 16 months ago, but I don't think I'll get a lot of disagreement in this room when I say the topic is even more timely today than it was then, for all sorts of reasons I needn't go into that are all well known to us. The threat posed by climate change raises serious questions about the roles and responsibilities of citizens who believe that governments and laws are not adequately addressing that threat. And I know that's going to be very much the topic of conversation today and throughout this colloquium series. What are the best ways for such citizens to go about bringing about the kind of societal change that they believe is necessary? What are their responsibilities to the institutions that form the basis of our parliamentary democracy and to the laws that are enacted by our elected representatives? Well, these are particularly difficult questions for all of us, but they become even more difficult for those who, as Stephen alluded, have lost faith in the legitimacy or the capacity of those institutions to address some of these issues, or who believe that certain laws are unjust or fatally flawed. These are difficult questions, but as difficult as they may be, they are important questions that carry implications for all of us. They force us to consider our responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, to future generations, and indeed to the planet, which we share with a multitude of other life forms, albeit sadly a diminishing multitude of life forms. And again, I'm sure that will be part and parcel of the discussions that go on during the course of this colloquium series. And so I'm excited to be here because this series, like the others, is going to explore important issues of this kind. And you have, as you can see, an extraordinary program of speakers in front of you, including the speaker we're fortunate to have with us today. None of this would be possible, however. I mean, all the President's office does is put up a little bit of dosh and ask for the best ideas and for people who are prepared to do something to create the Colloquium series. And thankfully, there are people in this university who are prepared to do that. People like Stephen Colas and Lynn Quarmby, and I think Holly Anderson has been involved as well, and others, in preparing us by getting the speakers lined up, preparing the course materials, helping the students to come together, and to facilitate the discussions that will take place. We also are very lucky that the Dean of Graduate Studies and his office has overseen the administration of this, and especially so because Gladys Wee, who's in that office, has made such a strong commitment back over there to support this series, and I know is one of the reasons why it's been as successful as it is. So thank you, Gladys. With that, we are honored to host Kimberley Brownlee today, who's going to be delivering a lecture on the philosophical case for civil disobedience. I know you're looking forward to that, as am I, so I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to ask Lynn Quarmby to come forward and provide a proper introduction for Kimberley. Lynn?
Thank you very much. Thanks. Hi, welcome everybody. Just quickly before I introduce Kimberley, I wanted to point out that this series actually has an arc to it that we put quite a bit of effort into what that was and the order of the speakers. And so I want to encourage people to try to come to as many of the lectures as you can. And I won't reveal the full arc at this moment, but I will let you know that after we hear today about the case for civil disobedience, what we will hear 2 weeks from today is how does civil disobedience impact policy, which I think, we can make a case and decide when and whether it is an appropriate action. But does it do any good, and how might it do some good? So having said that, you heard about Holly Anderson. So Dr. Holly Anderson is a professor in the philosophy department and was very engaged in the early stages of the discussion for this colloquium. And it was Holly that led us to Dr. Brownlee. And Holly is, with great regret, can't be here this afternoon, but she has prepared an introduction. So forgive me if I read it. But Holly would like us to know that Kimberley Brownlee is an associate professor of moral and legal philosophy at the University of Warwick. Before receiving her doctorate from Oxford in 2006, she studied at McGill, our McGill, and at Cambridge, and she is the recipient of an impressive range of fellowships and recognitions. And this is really great. Commonwealth Scholarship, a Rhodes Scholarship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a Leverhulme Prize. She's also held a number of visiting positions in philosophy departments, schools, research centers, places like Oxford, St. Andrews, UCLA. And I think, are you at UBC this semester, or you've had a term? Last year, okay. She writes on a range of moral and legal aspects of social life, and her current research focuses on the ethics of sociability, including topics such as the reasons and duties that we have to provide decent social contact to each other and the value of social inclusion. And I've enjoyed watching some of your YouTubes on that topic. I wish we had hours and hours. But she's best known for our purposes today for her work on civil disobedience, which culminated in her monograph, Conscience and Conviction, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2012. In that book, she argues that there is a general moral right to engage in civil disobedience, which is rooted in a humanistic respect for our dignity and agency as reasoning and feeling beings capable of deep commitments. Please join me in warmly welcoming Kimberley Brownlee.
I am unmuted. Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here at SFU. Although I've never studied at SFU or worked at SFU, I actually owe a tremendous amount to SFU, and that's because my parents met while they were studying here in the 1960s. And my dad's here today, actually. So without SFU, I probably wouldn't exist. So thank you for that. And I really want to commend SFU for holding this colloquium at this time. It's a tough problem for universities to address. Students tend to be active, tend to be engaged, tend to protest. Faculty can as well, and it's a difficult issue for university to confront. What are the proper parameters for protest? What stance should the university formally take or informally take toward the protest? And so it's really lovely. The university has provided a space for staff, students, and the community to debate seriously the merits of dissent, the merits of civil disobedience. So I'm really, really delighted about that. In their advertisements for the colloquium, the organizers, Stephen and Lynn, posed 3 questions. And my aim today will be to offer my responses, my thoughts on those 3 questions. So the first question was, at what point do citizens have a moral right to break the law in order to avert or reduce climate change? Is there ever a point where citizens not only have the right but have a duty to engage in civil disobedience to protect the environment? And third, how do we justify those violations of the law so that they strengthen our democracy and they don't undermine our democracy? And so I'm going to take those 3 questions as my frame, and along the way I'll offer a few thoughts that come down to earth and speak to the protests here at SFU. Now, before I do that, I want to start with a quote from former Vice President of the US, Al Gore, who has repeatedly advocated the use of civil disobedience in response to human-generated climate change. In one instance, he was being interviewed by The Guardian, this was in 2009, and he was quoted as saying, "Civil disobedience has an honorable history, and when the urgency and the moral clarity of a problem cross a certain threshold, then I think civil disobedience has a role to play. It's quite understandable, and I expect it will increase, no question about it." So it's a nice quote because it picks up on 2 things. The first is that honorable history of civil disobedience. This is an ancient history. It goes back to Socrates, refusing to defer to the Athenian assembly and insisting that he was going to continue to educate the youth and exhort them to lead a life of virtue. It includes Antigone. More recently, of course, it includes people we highly revere, famous dissenters, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Aung San Suu Kyi, Liu Xiaobo. There's a long list of people that we celebrate as part of that honorable history. Albert Einstein, there's a nice quote he gave about Gandhi, that generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon the earth. That's how revered some dissenters can become. And that reverence, the celebrated image of the dissenter, it's deserved for the people I've just listed. They've demonstrated their humanity, their independent-mindedness, their willingness to pay a very high personal price in order to communicate a sincere and deep conviction. And there are lots of quotations that affirm the uniqueness and the value of the dissenter. So there's one from the poet Archibald MacLeish, who wrote in 1956 that the dissenter is every human being at those moments of his life where he resigns momentarily from the herd and thinks for himself. And then John Stuart Mill, the famous liberal philosopher, writing about 100 years earlier in his book On Liberty, he said, in this age, and in our age as well, in this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom, is itself a service. And there are lots of others. There's one from George Bernard Shaw where he says that disobedience is one of the rarest and most courageous of the virtues. And I think this is why we have this image, this celebrated dissenter that we admire. So that's one side of Gore's quote, this honorable history. The other side to his quote is that he references this threshold. When the urgency and the moral clarity of a problem cross a certain threshold, then civil disobedience has a role to play. And the difficulty is knowing when we've passed that threshold. When is a problem sufficiently serious that it warrants resort to civil disobedience? And just to very briefly give you my own definition of civil disobedience, and actually in my writing I avoid defining it. As a philosopher, you can choose to define or not define it. You can be very, quite. Yeah, I won't demonize philosophers, but you can do a conceptual analysis without sort of pinning your colors to this is what it is and nothing else. So I actually take a paradigm case approach. I look at the key core examples. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat in December 1955. Let's look at a case like that. What are its key features? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about civil disobedience. And in my view, the key features of civil disobedience are that it's a deliberate breach of law, it's communicative, it's conscientious in that it's sincere, it's serious, it might be mistaken. So here, it's a different definition or a different conception from the one Stephen gave, which was that it was a breach of an unjust law in an otherwise just society. I see civil disobedience more broadly as a deliberate breach of law that might actually not advance a just cause. And it doesn't necessarily happen within a liberal society, it happens in lots of illiberal societies as well. But you engage in this breach of law in order to communicate a sincere concern and a sincere desire for lasting change. So you aim your disobedience at the level of reason and discussion. This is a highly constrained form of breach of law. This is not radical violence. This is not sort of excessive, unjustifiable vandalism, car bombings. That's not civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is very self-restrained. Its distinguishing feature is its civility. Now, coming back to Gore and this Al Gore's quote and this idea of the threshold, the question is, when have we reached a point where resort to suitably constrained communicative breach of law is defensible? And I think we have a lot of difficulty ever acknowledging that we might be in such a situation. We tend to demonize the dissenter in our office, on our street, at our university. We tend to value dissent in the abstract or in retrospect. We tend to value dissent that's aimed at someone else's policies, someone else's initiative, not our own. We become very uncomfortable next to the dissenter in our space. And the personal histories of the famous dissenters that I've mentioned, they're a testament to the fact that the majority tends to shoot the dissenter in the act and then celebrate her only much later. And sometimes that shooting's literal. So Gandhi was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Aung San Suu Kyi spent close to 20 years of time under house arrest. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Liu Xiaobo is now serving an 11-year sentence. This is what tends to happen when you are a dissenter. And the celebration, if it ever comes, is only much later. And those people I've just listed, they were all operating in somewhat illiberal regimes, or very illiberal regimes. But Edward Snowden is an example that we also have, who has fled the US and is living in Russia. So that's what that's the other side for the civil disobedient. We have very mixed attitudes toward people who dissent. And the historian J.B. Bury has a nice quote on this. He says, "Wherever prevails the belief that the welfare of a state depends on rigid stability, quote, novel opinions are felt to be dangerous as well as annoying. And anyone who asks inconvenient questions about the why and the wherefore of some accepted principles is considered a pestilent person. So I don't know how many of you have been taking part in the dissent and the disobedience here at SFU, but you're in good company with lots of people who have felt that they are seen as pestilent people, or that it takes guts to be a dissenter. And you have to hope for long-term recognition of your view, not short-term. And in addition to our negative judgments of dissenters, we have a lot of catchphrases and aphorisms that warn us against dissenting. So, don't rock the boat, don't upset the apple cart, mind your P's and Q's, respect your elders. Some of them are thinly veiled condemnations of behavior. She wants taking down a peg, he's going against the grain. Some of them are statements of fact. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Or a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. These are ideas we have about the value of conformity, coherence, agreement, consensus, deference. And so you're pushing against all of that if you decide to engage in civil disobedience. So it's with that very complex set of attitudes towards civil disobedience that I want to take up the organizers' 3 questions. And the first one was the question about rights. At what point do citizens have a moral right to engage in civil disobedience in defense of the environment? Now, I'll say a little bit about rights as our starting concept. A right, in liberal thinking, a right of conduct, it gives you a protected sphere, a protected space in which to act wrongly. So the classic examples, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, they protect you principally to do morally objectionable things. We have freedom of expression so that you can say things that are offensive. You don't need that protection in order to say things that are innocuous or praiseworthy or trivial. So your moral right of conduct gives you a certain sphere in which to act free from others' interference. And in the case of the rights I've just mentioned, expression, religion, thought, freedom of movement, these are legal rights in many places, not just aspirations. They are recognized in law. When it comes to civil disobedience, there cannot be a legal right to engage in civil disobedience, because civil disobedience is by definition, or by nature, illegal. It's necessarily a deliberate breach of law. So if there is a right to engage in civil disobedience, it must be a moral right. And moral rights, they're not contentious for many people, but some people have trouble with the idea of a moral right. And certainly some of my undergraduate students will ask me, well, who gets to decide? Who gets to say you have a moral right? And then my response is usually, well, you have to do lots of moral philosophy, and then you get to at least give an argument for why you have a moral right. Good way to recruit for classes. But moral rights, they exist regardless of the legislation, regardless of what the law says, regardless of what convention says. A moral right is a morally justified claim. So even if there's competing laws or competing conventions, if you have a morally justified claim, you have a moral right. So a society that, for example, doesn't recognize women's rights to political participation, in that society, I would argue, women still have a moral right to participate politically. It's not entrenched in law, they don't have a legal right to vote or to stand for office, but they have a morally justified claim to be recognized as equal citizens. Now, when we turn to civil disobedience, it's most plausible, or it's least contentious, to argue there's a moral right to engage in civil disobedience in an oppressive regime, in an illiberal regime. So the United States prior to the civil rights movement, or Myanmar, Burma, or China. There you can argue fairly quickly there's a moral right to engage in civil disobedience, because we tend to say things like there ought to be a law. And by that we mean there ought to be a legal right to engage in legal protest. And you have a moral right to engage in illegal protest to make up for the absence of that legal protection of participation. Now, some philosophers take the view that that's actually where the moral right to civil disobedience ends. Joseph Raz, who is one of the most influential living moral and political philosophers, he does argue that civil disobedience is reserved for illiberal regimes. There's no moral right to engage in civil disobedience in a liberal regime. And his argument is that one about participation rights. You are reclaiming the rights to participate that your society should be recognizing. And so you know, in the United States, prior to the civil rights movement, it would have been black people wanting to insist on equal recognition before the law, equal civil rights. They would have had a right to engage in civil disobedience to reclaim their participation rights that weren't being recognized. So if we think Canada at this moment is a liberal society, and I hope it is, then according to Joseph Raz, there is no moral right to engage in civil disobedience, even in defense of the environment. Now, you may be pleased to hear I don't agree with Joseph Raz. Joseph Raz was writing about civil disobedience in the 1970s. That's when there was sort of a wave of philosophical literature about civil disobedience, and a lot of that was in response to the Vietnam War. But there's been a new interest, a resurgence of interest in civil disobedience amongst philosophers. There's sort of a new generation of people discussing it. And what's come out is that there are at least two problems with Raz's account. The first is that in an illiberal society, like the United States prior to the civil rights movement, there would have been no moral right to act in solidarity in civil disobedience. So white people who agreed with black people who were pushing for their civil rights, they would not have had a moral right to engage in civil disobedience. And that seems counterintuitive. You know, that you can sort of run the argument two ways. One would be to say that the white people, although they sort of formally had ordinary channels of participation, they had no reason for themselves to resort to civil disobedience. Not all the interlocutors were at the table. Not all the people who had a voice or needed to have a voice were allowed to speak. And so white people, too, had a strong interest in participation rights being fully respected. But you can also run the more simpler thought that just it's very strange to restrict the moral right to civil disobedience to those people whose rights to speak are denied them, and not to people who share their position. Another sort of footnote to that thought is that what comes out of Raz's view is that there are only certain types of topics that you can have a right to civilly disobey in defense of. And so the environment would never be such a topic because it doesn't line up with denial of participation rights. So that's one problem, this sort of lack of space for solidarity. The second is that in a liberal society, Raz is mistaken to assume that people who are resorting to civil disobedience are invariably saying, what I'm doing should be legal. Raz says the reason you have no right to civil disobedience in a liberal society is because you have adequate ordinary channels for participation. There are no participation rights you have to reclaim. But even in a liberal society, if you're in the minority, you suffer from a certain amount of bad luck. Decisions have to be taken, votes have to be taken, policies have to be made, and it will be very difficult for the minority to get their voice heard adequately in advance of decisions being taken and votes being counted and decisions being made. So the thought here, this comes from David Lefkowitz, is that when you engage in civil disobedience in a liberal society, you're just dealing with the operational realities of politics. You're trying to make a little more space for defenders of the minority view to have an adequate scope in which to speak. Now, I know if you're interested in conceptual analysis, it might sound like there's an inescapable tension here in the idea of a liberal society, that can we ever give enough adequate space to the minority? And that may actually be sort of an inescapable problem about politics, that if you're in the minority, you're going to have a smaller microphone. You're going to have a harder time having your voice be heard. Now, in my view, Raz actually he's pinned his colors to the wrong idea when it comes to defending the moral right to civil disobedience. I don't think you root it in participation rights. As Lynn quoted from my book, in my view, the moral right to civil disobedience is grounded in a humanistic respect for people as beings who can have deep beliefs. Now, we have an inclination in liberal societies to be tolerant when people have very deep beliefs. So our inclination to accommodate the doctor who doesn't want to perform abortions, or our inclination to accommodate the parents who don't want their child to have a blood transfusion. We tend to make exceptions, we give exemptions, we narrow the law. We try not to label such acts as in breach of law, but we do have an inclination in liberal societies to tolerate dissent that's grounded in deep belief. Now, that toleration tends to be only for private dissent, private nonconformity. In my view, the people who have the best claim to that toleration are actually the people who are engaging in communicative dissent, communicative disobedience. When you sincerely believe something, you're willing to stand up and be seen. You know, we have this quote from Gandhi, "My life is my message." You don't act evasively. You don't act surreptitiously in order to save your own skin. You don't try to just swap jobs with a colleague so you don't have to perform abortions and not have it be known by your supervisor. You're willing to take some personal risk in order to be seen to defend your view. And if that's right, then the moral right to civil disobedience lies in a respect for that sincerity, that conviction, and a respect for the fact that we are expressive beings who want to communicate when we have a deep belief. That respect also is an acknowledgement that our society puts too much pressure on us when it requires us always to put the law ahead of our deep beliefs. And society puts too much pressure on us when it always requires us to act non-communicatively, to be self-censoring when we do step outside the line in defense of our beliefs. So that's the punchline, the sigh of relief you can breathe is that in a liberal society you do have a moral right to engage in civil disobedience. So if you've been dissenting here at SFU, you can rest easy. However, that conclusion is not going to be, it's not quite as weighty, not quite as satisfying as we might want it to be. And that's because a humanistic respect for persons doesn't discriminate amongst causes. A liberal toleration of a deep belief means tolerating the beliefs that are, in your opinion, my opinion, the society's opinion, highly objectionable. So the neo-Nazi, the animal rights activist, the anti-abortion activist, the US Second Amendment defender, the environmentalist, they all have the same moral right to engage in constrained disobedience in defense of their cause. And that's because we give them all that same humanistic respect that we are expressive beings who can have very deep beliefs. Now, I'm going to give us a way of distinguishing different types of disobedient actors. But before I do that, I just want to say that this moral right, in my view, although it can't translate into a legal right, and that's because civil disobedience by nature is illegal, this moral right can ground a legal excuse. And an excuse that I would label the demands of conviction excuse. Now, if you're interested in pursuing this, Jeremy Horder has written a book called Excusing Crime, and Jeremy Horder was for a while the law commissioner in England. He argues that there should be a demands of conscience excuse, and he and I are sort of talking about the same defense. We use slightly different language. He says there should be such an excuse for the private acts of disobedience. I argue that there should be this legal excuse for the communicative acts, that's where, if we want to be tolerant of conscientious disobedience, it's the communicative breaches of law that have the best claim to our toleration, the best claim to this legal excuse that I acted in the name of my conviction. So I'm happy to discuss that more afterward, but I'll move on to the next question that the organizers gave, and which gives us the way of distinguishing amongst civil disobedience, and that's the question about duties. So we want to be able to say, in defense of some civil disobedience, the Gandhis, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Aung San Suu Kyi's, that this is different. This passes the threshold that Gore was talking about. This kind of disobedience, it's not just morally right, protected by a moral right to do wrong, it's morally justified, it's morally required, and indeed the law should regard it as an act of necessity. So that's where we want to go. When, if ever, do citizens have a moral duty to engage in civil disobedience? And under what conditions should the law recognize it as necessary? Now, there are three reasons that we will find it very difficult to know whether we've passed that threshold. I raised this question at the beginning. When do we know that we've passed the threshold, that we're in a situation of moral urgency and moral clarity where civil disobedience is morally required, where it's a matter of duty? There are three reasons we're going to have difficulty knowing. The first is that when you're in the minority, you have to convince the majority that this is a situation of moral urgency. And the very fact that your view doesn't prevail means that others are not going to readily agree with you that this is a situation of moral urgency. And that lack of endorsement can cause you to be self-doubting. So there can be this general sense of unsureness, given it's a minority pushing, that we are in fact in a situation of urgency. The second problem is that liberal democracies, we have some complacent assumptions about liberal democracies. One is that they make good policies. A second is that even if they don't make good policies, they make procedurally sound policies. There's a process. We elect our representatives. There are certain mechanisms for citizen engagement. There are those ordinary channels for participation. And so there's a thought that even if you don't like the policy, it's gone through the proper procedure, and you have to put up with it, and at least use only the ordinary mechanisms to raise concerns about it. So we have complacent assumptions about democracies that might make us doubt that we are in a morally urgent situation. The third is the more general question of what is genuinely morally urgent? How do we know that our cause is generally morally urgent? As some of the dissenters I've referenced, they have a whole host and range of causes that can prompt people to disobey. What are the really morally most pressing ones? I think there are two strategies here to determine whether we're in a morally urgent situation. The first is to look at need. Non-contingent basic needs. As human beings, we have many non-contingent basic needs that if they're not met, we won't be able to survive as the kinds of beings we are. We have fundamental basic needs for breathable air, for drinkable water, for food, for shelter, for companionship, for basic level of subsistence and physical security, We have needs for certain basic skills, for education, for basic health. And we have more humanistic needs for minimally adequate social inclusion. This is my current research project. I'm very interested in our fundamental need as social creatures to be given adequate space to live in close proximity and relationship with other people. We have needs for political and legal recognition and needs for basic respect. Now that list of needs is not the list that you'll find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the International Covenants. Some of those things are in those documents, but for example, the right to breathable air, that's not in those documents. And all you have to do is plug your nose and close your mouth for 2 minutes and realize how fundamentally important that need is. It doesn't get more basic than a need for breathable air. So these needs, they're sort of my thoughts as a philosopher of what's most fundamental. And what's interesting is that some of the things in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international covenants are not among our most fundamental needs. The usual suspect that gets beaten at this point is the right to holidays with pay, which is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that right, I think the framers, they simply mistook the means for the underlying right, and that's the right to rest. But these basic rights, these basic needs of ours, they give us an entry point. They're still fairly abstract, but they give us a way of understanding when a situation of moral urgency will come up. We can also talk about the fundamental, basic, non-contingent needs of beings who can't defend themselves. Animals also have a fundamental need for breathable air, drinkable water, adequate nourishment, a decent habitat. That's the realm of moral urgency. The second way we can tell we're in a morally urgent situation, this comes from Kwame Anthony Appiah, who says we can look to whether we are in a situation that future generations are going to condemn. Are we doing something that a future generation is going to look back and condemn us for? And he says there are 3 signs that we are in such a situation. The first is that the arguments against the practice are already well known. So in his book Honor Code, he talks about moral revolutions, and his examples are foot binding in China, and dueling in England, and indeed slavery in the US. And he said in all 3 cases, the arguments against the practice were known. It wasn't that it was a sudden epiphany of, Chinese, foot binding of little girls is incredibly stressful and inhumane and cruel. It was known that this was a terrible thing to do to a young child. So that's the first sign, that we already know the arguments. And in the case of the environment, as he says, and as I would agree, we know the arguments against many of our practices, the devastation, the destruction, the apathy that marks a lot of our attitude to the environment. The second sign, he says, is that the people who defend the practices, defend the initiatives, they don't give moral counter-arguments. They instead talk about human nature, tradition, necessity. How would we function? How would we maintain our lifestyle if we didn't, continue to use the resources in the way we are? We didn't try to transport as much oil as quickly as possible. Those are the arguments that are made, not moral arguments. They're lifestyle arguments, tradition arguments. And the third point he makes is that, sorry, I've actually just blanked. It's that supporters engage in a kind of strategic ignorance, that they avoid looking at the real ramifications of the practice and why it is objectionable. And I think all three arguments apply to our situation with respect to the environment. And Appia, on the topic of the environment, he says it's not as though we're unaware of what we're doing to the planet. We know the harm done by deforestation, wetland destruction, pollution, overfishing, greenhouse gas emission, the whole litany. Our descendants who will inherit this devastated earth are unlikely to have the luxury of such recklessness. Chances are they won't be able to avert their eyes, even if they want to. So those are the ways we can tell that this is a situation of moral urgency. And there is one problem, though, particularly when it comes to the environment, and that is that it can be a collective action problem. Kwame Anthony Appiah points out that one person driving her SUV isn't going to make that much difference. And so that's a challenge if we want to collectively recognize we're doing a lot of wrong and harm. And I'd give two responses to that. The one is that it's not always a collective action problem, and here I'll come down to earth a bit. If you're talking about the twinning of an oil pipeline that will triple the amount of oil that's transported from Alberta to the BC coast, and that will increase the risks of leaks, of spills in the ocean, of damage to residential areas, of loss of animal habitat, all of that, that's not driving an SUV. That's not a collective action problem, or at least that part of it. And then there is, obviously, the discussion about the emissions that follow from its usage. So, although the environment may pose a difficulty that's distinct from Chinese foot binding or dueling, the individual act of binding a child's foot, that in itself is incredibly harmful. Not all acts that are related to harm to the environment are in themselves harmful. Nonetheless, some are. The second point is that even when an act is not in itself harmful, we do sometimes prohibit it because it's remotely connected to harms. So we restrict gun ownership. Even though owning a gun in itself is not harmful, there is the risk that harm will be done, and therefore we restrict it. So we can talk about the environment and environmental issues in the same breath as those that, the morally urgent situations that are not collective action problems, where it's clear that we are doing wrong. Okay, now with respect to, so the thought here is that when we're in such circumstances, we have a moral duty. It is morally required to engage in civil disobedience, and we should be able to argue that it is necessary before the law. Now, what's interesting is that civilly disobedient actors have had a lot of difficulty arguing that their act is necessary. In some cases they've managed, and I'll talk about two cases in a minute, but often the argument of necessity, and certainly with the higher courts, with appeal courts, it doesn't prevail, it doesn't succeed. And what was interesting when I started to explore this was that it actually had less to do with civil disobedience and more to do with the fraught territory of necessity in common law. Ian Dennis has suggested that there's something of a rejection amongst judges, common law judges, that there's a general principle of necessity. Judges seem to have taken the view that there couldn't be something of higher value in general than literal conformity with the law. And I think we can question, if there is such a general attitude amongst judges, we can question its reasonableness, because necessity comes into the law in many places under different headings and with different rationales, but with rationales that all are rooted in necessity. Self-defense, third-party defense, duress by threats, duress by circumstances, and now more recently medical necessity. These are all cases where necessity has been the driver in a claim that the law should not punish you. So I think there is scope to argue the necessity of civil disobedience within that same framework, sort of a pluralistic framework of arguments grounded in necessity. Now, the final question the organizers posed, which I want to turn to now, is really the elephant in the room, because we might think okay, your act of civil disobedience, it's commendable, it's honorable, you can make an argument for its moral justifiability, but it's undemocratic. There's a democracy problem. And so that was the third question. When can we justify these violations of the law as acts that strengthen our democracy rather than undermining it? And just to give you the view that's come from some appeal court judges who have thought that the seemingly undemocratic nature of civil disobedience is where the problem lies. This comes from Justice Hartz, who was speaking on behalf of the U.S. Court of Appeal for the 10th Circuit in a case called U.S. v. Platt. He said, "Civil disobedience can be an act of great religious and moral courage, and society may ultimately benefit. But if the law being violated is constitutional, the worthiness of one's motives cannot excuse the violation in the eyes of the law. History has not been short of the evidence of the risks and the evils that can attend subordinating the requirements of law to one's personal view of morality." So that's the challenge. How do you answer this concern that you have put yourself above the law? So I think that the democracy problem has three parts. The first part is a knowledge problem. And the problem here is that legislators have the supreme right to take strategic decisions on behalf of the community. So goes the argument. And if you civilly disobey, you are presuming to know more. You're presuming to have a better grasp of the salient reasons than the legislators have. So that's the first problem, the knowledge problem. The second problem is a paternalism problem. The thought here is that not only are you relating to the legislators inappropriately, you're relating to your fellow citizens inappropriately. You are improperly arrogating to yourself license to disobey the law, to disobey laws that other people are binding themselves to follow. So you're putting your own judgment ahead of the law in your community. That's the paternalism problem. The third problem is the procedural fairness problem. And really these three problems, they're all similar, or they're different takes on a similar core concern. The procedural fairness problem says that we have a certain set of procedural mechanisms by which we take democratic decisions, and in civilly disobeying, you are disregarding those procedural mechanisms. Okay, now each of these problems can be answered. So the democracy problem is not insurmountable. With respect to the knowledge part, it is doubtful that legislators are invariably better placed than on-the-ground experts to take into account the salient reasons regarding an initiative or a policy. Especially since legislators face certain pressures, the pressure of time, the pressure of competing political parties, the pressure of ideology, political capital, the pressure of well-funded lobbying groups who have profit-driven agendas. Those are all pressures on legislators who are trying to attend to the salient reasons. And they're not pressures that are faced by on-the-ground experts like environmentalists or scholars. The second response is that in addition to a person or a legislature's ability to be attentive to certain reasons or to understand certain reasons, there's the issue of motivation. So legislators face the threat of loss of power. They face the threat of the impact that the media and powerful lobbying groups will have on their political fortunes, and those are strong disincentives to attend to reasons that go against their electoral self-interest. And then, of course, there's just plain old corruption. So it's a very optimistic view of a democracy to say that the legislator, epistemically, in terms of their knowledge, is best placed to understand all the reasons that are salient to a decision. The third response is that even if the legislator did know best, Even if the federal government and the provincial government sort of were best placed to judge what types of initiatives relating to the environment to support or not, they can still benefit from concerted minority opposition. This is the standard Millian liberal thought that dissent is very valuable because it forces the defenders of the dominant opinion to remain alive to the arguments for their own view. It forces us out of our complacency. Okay, so that's responses to the knowledge argument, the knowledge problem. The second problem about paternalism, here, the first response is that democracy is a work in progress. Democracy is something that's ongoing. It's in the spirit of democracy that minorities continue to push and to challenge. We don't just take votes and then go home. And given, as I mentioned earlier, minorities have a smaller microphone, we have to give some leeway for people to engage in suitably constrained breach of law, to communicate their sincere beliefs that actually serve the interests of society. And what's interesting here is there's a double harmony. There's a harmony related to the civilly disobedient actor's moral right to breach the law. So the analogy here would be with a journalist. A journalist has a right to protect her sources, to go into dangerous places, to have access to certain information. But that right isn't rooted just in her own interests as a journalist. It's also rooted in society's interests in her having these freedoms. The same goes, in my view, for the civilly disobedient actor. Her moral right to communicate her deep belief, to have some constrained space outside the law in which to act, that is in society's interests, because that can be the only way sometimes to modestly rectify democratic deficits. So when debate on a topic is silenced, or when formal channels for communication seem to be sluggish, when people are becoming apathetic, civil disobedience can be a way to rectify that democratic deficit. And that's the double harmony. That's the interest society has that's the democratic interest society has in people using civil disobedience. Now, just as a small sort of footnote on this, there's it's probably apocryphal. I couldn't find a good reference for it, but there's a nice quote from FDR's presidency. When he first came into office, he reportedly had a meeting with labor leaders, and he said to them, "I agree with you, now go out and make me do it." So the thought being, in my formal position, my hands are tied. I'm limited in what I can do. And indeed, the closer you get to the center of power, the more limited you should see yourself as being. But he would benefit if people were willing to be on the ground, to push, to force discussion, to engage in some civil disobedience, to get some media attention. That would be how to advance a cause. The third point, so we're still talking about the paternalism problem and the responses to that. And the third response here is that if you civilly disobey, you are putting yourself forward with the risk of being punished. And you're doing so to communicate a sincere concern. And that sincerity and that willingness to accept the risk of punishment, that is a signal that you're not putting yourself above the law. You are not improperly arrogating to yourself some license to act in ways that others are not acting. You're actually willing to pay the personal price in order to raise an issue that you believe is very important. Okay, I will be very brief because I realize I may have passed over my time. Before I get to my response to the fairness problem, I just want to note two cases from the UK fairly recently where a judge and a jury didn't question the motives of the civilly disobedient actors. They didn't take the view that Hart's, quoted from the US case, the Hart's view that you've given yourself license to disregard the law. These two cases, the judge and the jury took the view that these were matters of necessity, that there was a sincerity and a value in the motivations of the dissenters. So in 2008, 6 Greenpeace activists were acquitted by a jury in Maidstone, UK, for occupying and criminally damaging the King's North Power Station for the amount of $50,000. The activists argued that they had a lawful excuse their act was taken to prevent the greater evil of immediate harm to human life and property caused by climate change. Now, in 2011, another group of environmentalists, 20 environmentalists, they were actually convicted by a jury for planning to do similar things at a different power station, a Ratcliffe power station. They didn't even get to do engage in the trespass and the vandalism. They straightforwardly argued the necessity. They didn't say it was an excuse, a lawful excuse. They said it was justified, it was necessary, given the serious injury caused by CO2 emissions. But the judge then stepped up. The judge took a very interesting view. This was Judge Tier. He imposed very lenient sentences. 18 months conditional discharge, and sometimes, in the cases of some of the dissenters, only 90 hours of unpaid volunteer work. And he said that while the society might think his judgment was very lenient, he was in a unique position. He said, neither the judge nor the jury need question the veracity and motivation of any of the defendants. You are all decent men and women with a genuine concern for others, and in particular for the survival of the planet Earth in something resembling its present form. So that's very heartwarming, and a good, I think a good example to think about. And from what I've seen of the video evidence of the protests here at SFU, that same self-restraint, that same commitment as a citizen seems to be evident in how the dissenters have acted here. Okay, finally, response to the procedural fairness problem. Here, the response is that actually, if you're simply disobeying, you're not being procedurally unfair. You're not disregarding the procedural mechanisms. You are responding to the comparative unfairness of being in a minority. And the thing to note is that unfairness, that comparative unfairness, is context sensitive. So a city mayor is in a comparatively less powerful position relative to provincial government and federal government. So you can be in a formal position and relative to many other people seemingly have power, but lack it in relation to those that you're trying to influence. And so sometimes, even if you're in office, resort to suitably constrained breach of law can be appropriate, can be legitimate. Okay, so where do we go from here? With respect to the protest here at SFU and in general in our reflections about civil disobedience. And there are two things I'd like to stress by way of conclusion. One is the vital importance of civility. If you're engaging in protest, if you're engaging in breach of law, you change the conversation when you use violence. You force the hand of the police, you change people's perceptions. People who might have been friendly to your cause can become antagonistic. And I think one reason we so revere figures like Gandhi is that they maintain their civility even in the face of very aggressive responses. Like, it seems almost superhuman. That's probably why Einstein given us this quote. That civility is paramount to demonstration of sincerity and a demonstration that you are acting at the level of reason and argument, not trying to be coercive or to force others to change policy. The second point I'd stress is the importance of maintaining a commitment even when the news dies down, even when the conversation's changed and it seems to become a neglected topic. If we're genuinely in a situation of moral urgency, then the dissenter has to maintain that commitment even if no one else is listening. And there's a couple nice quotes on this. One's from the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, who put it nicely, saying, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." And Václav Havel has a similar quote, which I'll finish with, on the nice thought about the value of trying to expand a society's moral horizons, trying to prevent a little bit of harm to victims, even if you can't fully change things. He says, "Even if a purely moral act that has no hope of any immediate and visible political effect, it can gradually and indirectly over time gain in political significance." So you can take heart from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was fantastic. So we have time for a few questions from the audience. Yeah?
I'm going to bring you the microphone.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So my question is, do you think there are group agents, such as perhaps voluntary associations, corporations, or universities, that have perhaps a right or even a duty to civil disobedience that is distinct from the rights or duties of their members?
Oh, that's a nice question. So I think it's true that group agents can be more effective. Rights of conduct and the humanistic argument I make for the right to civil disobedience, that is rooted in respect for persons, individuals' agency, individuals' autonomy, and also in the value of psychological integrity. So being given some space to defend your deepest beliefs, that's necessary if we care about you exercising independent judgment, if we want you to be not just deferring and conforming sheep-like, but if we actually want you to be reasoning, in the Aristotelian sense, a reasoning agent. So if you were to argue for a distinct group right, it would still have to be rooted in the individual interests of members, and I'm a bit skeptical because when I think of how groups operate, how collectives operate, their reasons for being tend to be animated by the interests of the group, not the interests of the people who are members to it. So one, just as a side, one topic I'm interested in right now is freedom of association, and there's a lot of attention on collective association. So, what are the rights of, can an orchestra choose to be all male? Can a tennis club choose to be white only? And those associations, their reasons for being are different from the interests of the members. So, so I'm kind of walking around your question because I like the idea that a collective could be more effective, could be more potent, and indeed a university could be quite powerful as a voice to say, we collectively disagree with this policy, we want to protect this land. But the rights that I think are animating civil disobedience are individual rights. It's as an individual that you accept the risk of punishment. It's as an individual that you confirm your commitment and you want to communicate that sincerely. So I think to some extent we walk alone when we dissent. Visibly, you see a demonstration and you see a whole group of people who may be there for a variety of reasons. So actually getting to the heart of why people are there and whether they are sincere and well-intentioned and committed, that can sometimes be really challenging. But it is as individuals that we act in civil disobedience. Yeah.
Thank you for your justice-friendly knowledge and experience. My question is about the use of different words in educating the community, because I find we don't tend to use words like justice-friendly, civil disobedience, and people are already kind of educated into conformity. So whenever there is the word civil disobedience, it looks like people start getting diarrhea. So but if you use words like justice-friendly or like be a child and say fair, then I think it does have a powerful message and more appreciation rather than greedy languages, Right. And so I just wanted to comment whether we should use language which is much more appreciated and fruitful rather than. And my second question is, can corporations who are very greedy, can they be also involved in civil disobedience, because it seems like they are breaking the rules, like in states we saw that, and yet nothing is done on them because they have not broken the law. So I don't know what is right and wrong.
Yeah, no, thank you. I like that. I think that qualifier, justice-friendly civil disobedience, or justice-oriented civil disobedience, that's, I think that could be a useful distinguishing feature of the civil disobedience we want to value. The thing, of course, to emphasize is that we can't be allowed simply to claim it, or we can't allow it to become just an empty description we attribute to our dissent, whatever our dissent is. You have to do the hard work of the moral arguments why people should regard this as supporting justice, why this is a matter of moral urgency. But yes, no, that might be a useful way of distinguishing. So I think I want to emphasize, which I didn't in the talk, the distinctive feature of civil disobedience, and indeed private, personal disobedience, is that it's not like ordinary offending. It's not like an ordinary breach of law. And I think when you look at how judges have responded to civil disobedience, they've really struggled because there's no formal offense, civil disobedience. And some judges say this is not a legal concept, this is a philosophical concept. Other judges, however, say, they make a very similar statement to Al Gore, that this is an honorable practice. It has been very influential and important in our history. This is often said in the US, that it has pushed the majority to confront its own beliefs. It can make us uncomfortable, but that's not a bad thing. So civil disobedience and what's called conscientious objection, or what I would call personal objection, it's not self-aggrandizing, self-promoting. It's very different from ordinary offending. The intention is what distinguishes it. So my trespassing on someone's property just to get to where I want to go more quickly, that's in no way civilly disobedient. Someone who does that communicatively, visibly, in order to convey a sincere concern, they have a very different motivation. So a corporation, I don't know of any examples of corporations engaging in what I would call civil disobedience. There's a lot of corporations engaging in law breaking, but it would in a way be quite interesting, and maybe sort of come back to the question about sort of a collective exercising or trying to exercise a moral right. I think
Can I just?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, because I'm quite interested in health promotion and so on, and I find a lot of corporations are selling or marketing very poisonous food, or even alcohol and so on.
Yeah.
And they get away with it with wrong labels and so on. And I wonder, is it they are doing it because it's the legal right to poison people, whether it's Coca-Cola or whatever, and yet the community and health status of the community suffers?
Yeah. No, I think. I think that is another type of democracy problem. When we're unable to hold powerful corporations in check, and when sort of their law breaking seems to go unacknowledged or certainly unpunished, and people who are doing very modest, sort of crossing a police line, it's much more modest breach of law. They're the ones who are being punished. So, I think I can only just reemphasize that there's a very different intention, very different motivation if you're civilly disobeying than if you're just breaking the law.
Kimberley, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'll disclose two things about myself. One is I'm a lawyer and legally trained, and the other is my father was a Quaker and a conscientious objector, so there were a lot of discussions over time about these questions. I was interested in your effort to try to ground the reconciliation of conscientious objection or civil disobedience with democracy by looking at law and seeing where law has offered some hope of excuse or legitimacy. Because what my father would have said is that the justification doesn't lie there at all. His argument always was that the way in which he justified civil disobedience in his own context was in his acceptance and that of others who engage in it to accept the consequences of the law. In other words, he wouldn't look to the law to make those kinds of concessions. He would, in fact, expect the law to visit upon him the full consequences of the law. And it's in his acceptance of that the reconciliation takes place. The law has prescribed certain penalties. Society has prescribed certain penalties. He would say that it's his acceptance and that of others to accept those penalties that provides the reconciliation between his expression of belief, which you ground your view of civil disobedience in, with the broader acceptance and legitimacy that he accords to the broader democracy. So the attempt to try to find comfort in concessions of law would seem to him, I think, certainly seems to me somewhat contradictory to that thought.
So Gandhi very happily went to jail, but Gandhi was not the least bit supportive of the British rule in India. So the response to your thought would be, going to jail, accepting the punishment, accepting the full consequences, that can be strategically valuable. It doesn't have to signal fidelity to the system or an attempt to reconcile with those who are oppressing you or who are silencing you. So I think like that thought, John Rawls, who's one of the most influential writers on civil disobedience, wrote his book A Theory of Justice in the 1970s. He does see the civility of civil disobedience lying in your willingness to accept the consequences. So that's part of it. You also publicly announce in advance that you're going to break the law, which of course gives the police a chance to prevent you from doing it. But through your publicity and through your acceptance of the consequences, you show that you are civil, that you have a fidelity to the law, you're not a revolutionary. And actually, so on Rawls's view, Gandhi was not a civilly disobedient actor because he was a revolutionary. But I think we can read too much into the willingness to accept punishment, that that it can also be strategic. Martin Luther King Jr. said, go ahead, punish me. You will actually heighten my cause if you do that. I think the other thing about punishment is that in the ideal scenario, it is communicative. It is a dialogue. But the problem with punishment is that it gives the offender her part. It gives her response. It says, this is the amount you'll be punished. It will be at this point that we will recognize you as being reintegrated and as having sort of done your time and that you are now a fully recognized member of society. So because it doesn't let her write her side of the dialogue, punishment is not necessarily a mockery of communication, but it doesn't do what it claims to do. It's sort of presenting itself that way, but it's unless we change how we punish and actually give the offender some space to respond to how she's being punished and to perhaps even affect how she's being punished, it's not living up to the standard it has to for that argument to go forward.
We definitely have time for another question or two if there are.
Don't be shy.
I have one if no one else speaks up. I'm happy to be quiet too. Maybe I'll go ahead with it. Oh, here we go.
Thank you for your talk. This is kind of related to what that gentleman was saying, but I wanted to ask if acts of civil disobedience hold more claim if in response to certain corporate actions that may in themselves be against the law, where the law does not address their action.
Right. Not until we look at the content. So, what is the law that the corporation is breaking? It might actually be a bad law. If it is a bad law and they're breaking it, and then we engage in civil disobedience in response to that, we haven't actually done something more defensible. So we, in principle, it sounds right. It sounds okay if corporations are sort of taking. Sort of viewing themselves as above the law, if they're acting in ways that we strongly oppose, we sort of have to step up where the law isn't. But there's first this worry about content. There's also this worry about vigilantism, that we are in a way we're then I think the democracy problem does start to get going. If we sort of feel, okay, the reason we have to civilly disobey is to keep them in check with the law because the law isn't doing its job properly. So I'd want to know more details before we started to say, yes, we're even more justified if it's in response to a corporation breaking the law. Yeah.
I've got a question here because both of these gentlemen brought up the problem with the corporate power, and I'm thinking through lobby and just their wealth. So would you say that civil disobedience is the cash of the disenfranchised?
I think it can be. So it's it's not always. How committed are you? How willing are you to keep pushing, to keep discussing, to keep raising the issue, even if it's no longer getting news attention? There's a thought amongst philosophers that likelihood of success is actually one condition for being justified. In addition to having a good cause and being well motivated, there has to be some prospect that you're going to have an impact. Otherwise, you are sort of needlessly you're doing risk and potentially doing harm. I think sometimes it's actually most justifiable to resort to breach of law when you are least likely to be effective. That's that's sort of when we seem to have most sympathy, provided your cause is well founded. It's the ANC pushing for so many years to try and change the apartheid regime. That's and seemingly going nowhere. It's that's when you have to resort to civil disobedience. So. I guess the short answer would be yes. But you have to use it well and use it often, and again, that's stressing the importance of civility for it really to be as valuable as you suggest.
I think I can do the math, though, because if civil disobedience is communicative, as you suggested, and if in the United States at least money is speech, according to the corporations being people, if we've put all this together, then I think maybe civil disobedience can be connected to money.
Can I add to that? Yeah. I thought that the two judgments in the British court were very interesting in relationship to our two friends here that brought this together, because they had a slap suit put up against them on the cost of those pipelines and what they're going to lose. And yet, in that first case, basically that $60,000 was dismissed. And I'm thinking that in their cases, they were fighting the same cause. They're saying the harm that the pipelines were going to bring about. The other one I thought was interesting is that in the second case, the protesters were fined with basically doing volunteer work. And I'm thinking these two gave volunteer work by giving up their time and teaching and work. And I actually talked to people in the protest line that did give up a whole month of work. So they actually were volunteering, and some of these people may have got fined volunteer work for actually doing volunteer work. Isn't that ironic?
No, thank you. It's a nice point.
Lindy?
I just have a quick question about an underlying assumption that I heard a few times about dissent being the minority. So federally here we have a very powerful federal government that actually does not have the majority of the popular vote. And definitely the active, visible dissenters are in the minority. It's debatable that they are really representing the minority views. So I'd just like to hear your comments on when dissent is not necessarily the minority voice.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good clarification. And I wouldn't, it's not majority and minority, I wasn't using them in a sufficiently technical sense to mean numbers. It was more just the dominant view and the view that's not prevailing. We need a tidier label for it, but it's when you're defending the view that is being demonized or that isn't being fully recognized, that's what it meant to be in the minority. But yes, women are the minority. As the majority.
Can I ask my question quickly, though? Or it's actually it might be a short answer. Can I pose a definition of democracy, and then you can tell me if you think it's philosophically sound or not. But it's actually an argument for a very broad definition of democracy that would include all sorts of things like civil disobedience that might at one level seem counter to some definitions of democracy. And so I'm working from something we often hear in the kind of philosophical arguments you laid out, which suggests things like, well, in a just society, here are the justifications we'd have to mount for something like democracy, like civil disobedience. Whereas in an illiberal, with liberal and illiberal, I want to go back to those terms used. So in an illiberal society, then there'd be a different set of justifications. In fact, it's probably much easier to defend oppositional or dissenting acts. So the problem with models of, in my mind, as I'm thinking it through, of this is saying this is a liberal government, this is an illiberal, state or society, is that in some ways, conceptually, that presumes a kind of steady state. And we can look at it and go, oh yeah, I can see that it's liberal, illiberal. Whereas in fact, democracy is this messy thing. It's constantly transforming. It's constantly going this way and that way. And the kind of things that are popping in my mind is we're constantly hearing these days, usually it seems to be Texas or somewhere, of some crazy, horrible local law that's saying, oh, women can't do this, or oh, now we're going to do this about immigrants. And and it's just totally uneven terrain that it's almost impossible to stand back, I think, and say, oh yeah, this is a just society, or this is an unjust society, or this is liberal and illiberal, because it's constantly transforming. It's a site of struggle, is what I would argue. So I would suggest that if that's the case, if democracy is a site of constant transformation and constant struggle, that it's important to have lots of tools or ways of entering that struggle. Because we can't assume that there's a steady state and we go, oh, well, because this is a liberal society, I know now safely I can do these and those, and I shouldn't do those other kinds of actions.
Right. Yes. No, that's great. I like that. That's really, yes. No, I think that's right. So the person I referenced with respect to liberal society was Raz, and he says we have a liberal society if you have adequate ordinary channels for participation. But yes, that doesn't take into account the shifts and I'm thinking he would say, okay, it's diachronic. So if we look at the last generation or even the last 5 or 10 years, how much space is there for participation? And he would say, okay, that one's liberal or liberal enough, and then you don't have the moral right to engage in civil disobedience. The other person who has contributed a lot to discussion about what makes a liberal state is John Rawls in A Theory of Justice, where he outlines his 2 principles of justice. The first being that there's adequate protection of civil rights and civil liberties, so freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and then also that there's the second principle is that there's fair equality of opportunity. So how fair and equal are the chances that people have to be well educated, to get certain types of jobs, to contribute, to influence, to participate in general, not just politically, but in the whole sense as citizens. So these are quite hard standards to meet, actually. It might end up with the result that no existing society is liberal. Which, if you want to engage in civil disobedience, anything, okay, great, go for it, we're fine. But that is the aspiration. We actually want to have a society where there are adequate, meaningful participation channels. That doesn't mean getting your way. It doesn't mean you win, but it does mean that you're given a space to present your case in front of national boards, that you have a voice that is heard, you're not summarily dismissed or denied a hearing, and so on. But no, I like, that's a nice point, which the theory doesn't really take into account.
Thank you.
I think it's time to say thank you. Okay, so thank you so very much for making the trip here, and we're extremely glad that your parents came to SFU.
Yes.
A wonderful talk. So please join us in thanking Dr. Brownlee. And we do have a token for you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's good. Whoops.
Yeah,
It's got my name on it too.
No, please do open.
Oh, wow. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Oh gosh. Thank you very much. Thank you. That is lovely.
It's a talking stick, so whoever holds it, it's the...
That's really nice. Thank you very much. That is gorgeous.